Here we are. We are live
We are
now. Thinking Link.
Oh, we are live. Okay.
Woo!
Wouldn't be a good day without
Working
a
through.
technical glitch.
Right,
This is how it rolls.
I'd imagine this old-fashioned when you see the television screen when there's a technical error and it just appears in front of you and no one can see anything. Anyways, for those of you who are now hopefully joining, this is Think and Link. It's Thursday where we have an engaging and intellectual, curious conversation with two amazing minds. And the two we have on stage today, Jeffrey Morris and Kevin J. Anderson, are going to be talking about space, time, the future, designing the future, some really interesting topics that we're rather excited about. We are in a wonderful platform here that has had some technical challenges.
Message.
It says no sound in the message.
Okay. All right.
Today. Let's see. We have a furious, fast and furious team behind the scenes that are trying to remedy this.
Yeah, working through this. Hopefully that'll show up soon. Otherwise, I'll do signals as to what I'm talking about. Well, yes. Maybe small pause where Richard tries to figure this out and says and gives me a go ahead.
Okay, now we can hear you guys. I just got
excellent, wonderful.
Working now. Thank you, Joel.
Well,
thank you. All right. So we are here for a Thursday conversation. I do want to still put in the plug for our major sponsor, Capsule, here in Minneapolis. And one of our most amazing clients, Jeffrey, is here on the stage with us, as well as we have had so many other wonderful clients over 22 years as a special projects firm working in the areas of design, marketing, and brand. But the focus of this conversation is going to be the inspiration we can find in the design of the future. So any other things I should be bringing up there, Kelly, before we...
No, just again, thank you, Jeffrey and Kevin, for joining us. Very excited that we are now able to talk with you both about a myriad of topics that I know we've briefly spoken to before, but are excited to share with our audiences. But before we jump into questions, would love for you both to give a quick lowdown as to who you are, sort of your history, what's brought you here today, and then we'll jump right in. Kevin, can we start with you, and then we'll turn it over to Jeffrey?
Sure, I'll do a quick warp speed introduction. I'm a very prolific science fiction and fantasy author. I have published 175 books, well, maybe 176 since last time I counted. I'm in 31 languages with 23 million books in print. Let's see, I've written for Dune. I helped work on the recent movie that came out last year. I've worked for Star Wars and X-Files and Star Trek and Batman and Superman and a handful of other movies. And I also got together working with my friend Jeffrey Morris here, who is a great and imaginative filmmaker. And we got connected through our mutual interest in the space program. And we had a mutual friend who introduced us, and he started telling me about his project called Persephone, kind of a alien planet survival story. It was really great. And we started brainstorming, and our first Zoom call lasted 4 hours or so before we decided to give it up.
We need to stop.
It was just like a great synergy going on. And we had all kinds of wonderful ideas because he comes at it more from a design and a film visual perspective. And I'm kind of Mr. nitty-gritty plot details and story outlines. And we just really kind of fit together with his strengths and my strengths. And so we worked on Persephone together. We did the novel here and working on the film, which Jeffrey will talk more about, and some other projects. So I've written in comics and in novels and in short stories and in computer games and even the lyrics for 2 rock CDs and lots of other stuff. So I'm an ADD guy that I just do whatever seems interesting.
It's working in your favor.
Yeah, before I go too much into my background, I just want to take 30 seconds to talk about how much I admire Kevin. It's like I had been reading Kevin's books since the 90s. And actually, there was one book that he wrote. He talked about other franchises he's worked on. There was a book he wrote about Superman's dad, like the time period before Krypton blew up, and the whole story of Krypton and Kal-El and Jor-El and that sort of thing. And I was just blown away by this book, and I was like, God, this author is so good. And following all his Dune novels and other things, and stuff. So it was incredible for me to be able to meet him and have us connect on such a powerful level, which is pretty awesome. As far as my background is concerned, I directed commercials, music videos. I actually worked for NASA at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for about 10 years doing education and public outreach work. All along the way, I've been a screenwriter and production designer and developing my own intellectual properties, that sort of thing. I launched my own production company in 2010. It's called FutureDude Entertainment. FutureDude is kind of a term that I coined in order to I want to popularize science the same way that Bill Nye the Science Guy, Carl Sagan, people like that, Gene Roddenberry, some of the heroes that I have. So the FutureDude brand is all about creating realistic visions of the future and creating, plausible technology, plausible science scenarios, but also inspiring today's generation to work for a better future, that sort of thing. So we're developing a number of feature films. As Kevin talked about, Persephone is kind of our flagship project right now. It's slated to go into production next year. It's starring Ming-Na Wen and Brianna Hildebrand and Isai Morales. And then we have a couple of other projects, an animated film called Parallel Man that we're developing, and also Oceanus, which is an underwater project. So all that's going on, and good times. And it's been fun working with Kevin. And Capsule's been an incredible partner for me. As a matter of fact, Kevin, hold up the book for a second, would you? Again.
Sure.
Yeah. So up just a little bit, up just a little bit, up. There's a logo.
There's a logo.
There. Okay. Now down. The logo.
There you go. There we go. There's he's looking at the logo.
That logo was designed by Capsule, and I've been working with Capsule since 2013, and we've had a tremendous collaboration. For me, having a background in design and marketing and that sort of thing, I feel like we speak the same language, and you guys get the futuristic kind of classic bent of what I want to do. And it's just been an amazing partnership. And you guys have helped me to define and clarify my brand. And I believe as we go forward, it's going to be instrumental in our success. So I want to thank you guys.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
Well, we fell for you when we first met you at our old office, and it was just such a wonderful, your philosophy on life and science and the future. And you first think of you hear the name, the FutureDude, and you're like, is this guy just like really big head? Like he's going to be really arrogant, right? And then you meet him, and the contrast is so extraordinary. He's just so kind and humble and generous.
Well, thank you very much.
Good at his work, and it's just it was wonderful for us from the beginning. So there's all kinds of stories to go with that we'll perhaps drop in as we go through this. But I'll hand it over to Kelly for our first question.
No, I'm really excited, Jeffrey and Kevin, and you just touched on this blending of fact fiction, sci-fi as a life experiment, and how you bring that to life. And I know we'd had some previous conversations around designing futures and projecting into the future and what that looks like, for better or for worse. With that, I'd love to hear, if you could, both of your perspectives, because I'm imagining it's different, which will be interesting to hear, where you each draw your inspiration, imagining worlds in the future and that futurism and how that comes to life. If you could both share that, I think that'd be really helpful to sort of set the stage for this conversation. Kevin, you want to start, and then Jeffrey would love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. I'll throw in some kind of background on science fiction, because science fiction is like maybe we predict the future, but I think what I like with science fiction is we get to practice the future, that we get to kind of think of things and do a fast forward and say, well, what if this happens? And, it doesn't always have to be a warning or a dark thing, but it is good for us to maybe do some course corrections. And with science fiction, we can tell stories that we don't have to experience ourselves, right? So I firmly believe that in the 60s, all of those horrific science fiction novels predicting how terrible it would be after a nuclear holocaust, the On the Beach and Alas Babylon, and there's just all kinds of the day after, all kinds of these, look how terrible nuclear war would be. I think that really had an effect on us not exchanging nuclear weapons. I mean, I think without all those warnings, you hear some, I think the technical term is idiots, talking about, oh, it's not so bad to just lob a few nukes here and there. Well, I think those science fiction stories did that. And right now, our current, um, it's not a mission because not everybody's doing it, but I think one of the more important things that science fiction is doing right now is projecting ahead to see just how bad it would be if we passed the tipping point in climate change.
Yeah.
That we can tell stories after this happens, and maybe enough people will start thinking about it so that we don't have to go off that cliff. And I know Persephone does some of that in its background story, but
Absolutely. Yeah.
go ahead, Jeffrey. That's kind of a handoff to you there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the things that's fascinating, literally, we're experiencing a science fiction moment right now. All of us, if you watch a movie like 2001: A Space Odyssey, 1968, right? They had a video conferencing type telephone booth where one of the characters was talking to his daughter on screen, right? Now, to the people watching that film in the 1960s, it was like, whoa, look at that. That's really cool. Okay. So if you think about it, we're living in their future in a lot of ways, right? That future, that's not, I mean, if you think about all the technology that we have, things that we completely take for granted, our smartphones, laptops, all these different things, these are like science fiction concepts in a lot of ways. Arthur C. Clarke, the fantastic author, he was one of the I guess originators of communication satellites. It was through one of his stories that he wrote, I believe, in the 1940s. So the point is, science fiction's really pointed the way for many things like technology, social science, philosophy. A lot of I think there's stories that were told in the past that we would consider to be fables and almost fantasy, but in a way they were almost like science fiction stories. So right. I think that's really fascinating, in a lot of ways. So so for me personally, I'm a voracious. I'm always looking at the news, and I'm looking at tech news and science news, and I'm trying to look at trends, and I'm trying to really pay attention to the realities behind these trends. And so when I write stories and when I develop worlds, I'm trying to predict based upon these trends. Now, some of it doesn't work out. It's very it's very funny. We joked about if we went back in time and told ourselves in the 1990s during the Obama presidency, we joked, my writing partner and I, would we say, will there be flying cars or a black president? And we were like, which one do we think would exist in 2016 or 2012 or whatever, right? And it was really interesting. So we probably wouldn't have thought that the president thing would happen, but that we would have flying cars. So it's just an interesting kind of discussion, those sorts of things.
Right.
Anyway, a little background.
And one of the things that really astonishes me is, if you remember from the old classic Star Trek episodes where they're Captain Kirk and Dr. McCoy, Mr. Spock, they're sitting in this conference room, and there's this like 3-sided computer monitor in the middle of the table, and Captain Kirk says, computer, what year was Napoleon born? And it just chug, working, chug, and then it spits out the name. And I've got Alexa Echo Dots all throughout my house, and I can just walk along and I can just say out loud, tell me what the weather is tomorrow, or what. And we have done this. How old is Tom Cruise? Things like that. You just speak it into the air and the answer comes back to you. Right. And that is so far beyond anything that Star Trek predicted for the 23rd century.
Right.
And I mean, how many of us looks at a map before we drive anywhere anymore? I mean, you just get in the car and say, hey Siri, tell me how to get here, and you just listen to the directions. Sometimes driving off a cliff if the directions are wrong. But
yeah, that's
well, that is one of the warnings about all this, that we have become so passively reliant on having this information at our fingertips. We're old enough, and I don't know that I could go to the library to the reference section to look up the data that I'm looking for.
Right.
Because we're so used to Googling it or Alexa or whatever it is.
No, it's funny because I actually, we were just debating, like the interface design. So I do production design, right, for my films. So when I'm designing a spacecraft, I have been putting like like push buttons and switches and things in the cockpits of these ships, and people say to me, but SpaceX, they don't have that. They have touch screens and you just voice command. I mean, in the future it won't be like that. And I actually believe that there could be a pushback. I mean, I think about this idea of having such a reliance on sort of a lack of tactile surfaces, tactile interfaces, that it could put us in a lot at some point as well, right? Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
And I
can't type on a smooth iPad screen. I need to have the real buttons.
Oh yeah, it's really interesting. We were realizing the other day that when we were editing a script, we find the typos better when we print the script out and physically look through it than sitting there looking at it on a screen. I mean, if you think about it, these technologies are very, very new. This is only a fraction of the human experience, right? If you think about, tens of hundreds of thousands of years, right? This is really a really quick span of time,
Yeah.
Right.
And I'm not sure we really fully understand the impact it's having on us.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, if you think about like not to go back to the nuclear piece, but the nuclear button is a button, right? You're not going to do a voice command for the nuclear.
No.
Right. That's just
Voice commands couldn't pronounce the word nuclear. They would call it
right.
nuclear.
Right. Did you say nuclear? I can't tell. You imagine Alexa coming back to you. Was that nuclear? Are you sure? Nuclear? Yeah. Right. I mean, there's certain things that have a certain importance. Yeah. Versus the all the way to nothing. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I love that, Jeffrey. It's like having some tactile. You lose things.
I just think it's important, and I think the audience can relate to. Oh, if I could just one more aside, it's fairly interesting because I had someone critique this submarine design for my film, the underwater film. They were like, "Yeah, nowadays you would just tell the sub where to go," and I had a response to this person. I was like, "Okay, so think about this. If I'm making a space film and I want to do a chase through an asteroid belt, like in The Empire Strikes Back, how exciting would it have been if Han Solo kept telling the computer, okay, turn right here, no, turn left, no, just avoid all of these. I mean, it's just, you know what I mean? You have to see somebody steering and moving. I mean, that's fun. That's exciting. And I'm not going to lose that. I'm not going to lose that in my futuristic vision. I just don't. I think you got to keep. That's part of humanity connecting. I think that's really important.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Well, that's actually that's a visual filmmaking thing. And one of the things I was so amazed about in the show, and I know you love it too, Jeffrey, is in The Expanse, that their space battles and their asteroid stuff, they spend all their time programming things in the computer and then sort of sit back and it happens. Because it's so, you got to fire this missile 3 hours in advance so that it can be at this place where this ship is, and they have to account for, I mean, that's realistically probably the way it's going to be, rather than flying X-wings and shooting blasters.
Oh, of course.
But it doesn't look as good in film to have
it's not as cool
there and say execute and then sit back and wait for the. I mean, in The Expanse, the battle is over the moment they execute the plan, and then they basically just sit back in their acceleration couches and. It's exciting when you read the books because you know what all the complexity goes into it, but when you're watching it on film, it's boring. And that, not that The Expanse is boring, but Jeffrey and I, we talked about it, and it's just, that's the way you plan it and think it. And in fact, that's one reason, one of the greatest science fiction books, one of the best-selling science fiction books, is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. And in Ender's Game, it's this kid, military battle genius, and he's plotting all these moves and positioning his, and it's chapter after chapter of his brilliant tactics, placing ships and placing characters. But when you watch the movie, it kind of fails because the audience isn't intellectually engaged in all the complexity that's going on, because you can't see it visually. You can do it mentally when you read the book, but it's not nearly as effective watching it as a movie.
Right. Right. You have to be completely cognizant of how it shows up visually in a movie screen or how it shows up in a book and how that content is consumed, right, by your audience. Jeffrey,
Well,
you have.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, Kelly, one of the things we talk about quite a bit too is the difference between writing I see there are three types of sci-fi storytelling that I've been engaged in, right? There's the novel side, the stuff like what Kevin does. And then
Hmm.
there's TV, which has a completely different set of rules because you might have 10 episodes to tell a story, or it used to be 26 episodes to tell a story, right? And then you've got a movie where you have 90 minutes to 2 hours to tell a story,
Right.
right? They're all so different. They have such
Sure.
different demands, and you can't, and so one of the things that I've really been pushing my team to do is to develop a movie as a movie. A movie's not a TV show, and it's not a novel, right? You
Mm-hmm.
can do different things in all those different places. So it's
Yeah.
interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So I want to get back to or I want to not get back to, but continue this conversation deep into the space when you guys talk about thought experiments, which we love because we put that in our book, the Physics of Brand book, and it is a wonderful way to ideate or to look at challenging problems. But you go deep into the future and the conversations you have back and forth. Give us a little bit of insight into your ideation when you're looking at the future, and how you're thinking about these things, and how that comes to life in the form of thought experiments. Kevin, you want to start with that one?
I One of my pieces of tech, one of my best pieces of tech for writing is this thing. It's a digital recorder, and I live in Colorado. I live in the mountains. I've got beautiful hiking trails all over the place, and I when I'm starting a book, when I'm world building, when I'm plotting something, I'll take that recorder with me and I'll just go out on a 10-mile hike. I'll be off in the middle of nowhere and kind of surrounded by nature and incredible inspiration, and I just let my thoughts go wild. It's like, well, what if this happens, what if that happens, and wait, we need a character to do this, but if that character is the stepson of this character, and then they'll have this conflict here, and I just sort of let it go wild as sort of a schizophrenic brainstorming operation. And uh, one of the things that I know from my background in doing other work, and I worked for the Department of Energy for 15 years, and I worked at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. I spent some time down in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And when I was studying the whole history of the Manhattan Project and Oppenheimer and how he brought together the greatest nuclear physics minds from around the world, and they put them in secret in this installation out in the New Mexico mountains. The reason that Oppenheimer picked that place, which was in the middle of nowhere in the New Mexico mountains, is he used to go there as a boy, sort of as a dude ranch. And he thought that the wide open spaces, the mountains, the mesas, the deserts, that just seeing that spectacle freed you of limitations and it opened your minds. And he wanted to bring all the nuclear physicists there because they could come up with bigger ideas if they were out in such a wide open environment. And I kind of parallel that when I'm out hiking because it sort of lets my all the endorphins go and all the sensory details, and it just opens my imagination. So I'm in Colorado. Jeffrey, though, is in Minneapolis. He's not too many mountains around there, but
No. Inspiration for me comes from study. I guess for me, it's like you said, Aaron, it's a thought experiment. Like, so I do a lot of what if. So
Mhm.
like Persephone, one of the things that's frustrating for me, this is really a big frustration. I've got these stories about the future, and I kind of like I'm doing a story about an underwater city. I just kind of wish people would build an underwater city, but you have to think about why would they really do that? Who would really do that? Who would have the resources to do that, right? And as a matter of fact, when I wrote a prequel to the universe of my underwater city, and it's about how did it get built, why, how, and why, and it really I said it pretty much nowadays, and it's about these kind of Elon Musk type. It's kind of like Elon Musk versus Jeff Bezos kind of thing that happens in this story. And I took a lot of inspiration looking at their conflicts and things that are going on with them, and I used that to say, how could an underwater city or this sort of thing gestate out of that, right? That's sort of how I do it. Or like with Persephone, I started off with studying that there was a real planet that was discovered in 2016 orbiting the nearest star. The nearest star is called Proxima Centauri. It's like a little over 4 light years away from here. The idea is that this planet could sustain life. Okay, they've discovered this. So I start researching that. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to sustain life? Like as we know it? I mean, what would it be like on this planet? What would it, And so then I started going, okay, so then how would you really get to the planet? All right, well then who would you take? And I started figuring this out. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, who would pay for this? Why would this happen? So then I started using climate change as a motivating factor to say, if we hit this tipping point, something that I've been studying for a lot of years, this idea that, I don't know if you guys know about this, but up in the Arctic Circle, there's a lot of methane locked in the frozen the tundra up there, right? The permafrost. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of fear that as the temperatures rise, that methane could get released and released in huge amounts, right? Okay. And the idea is that if that happens, it could push it, even if we do all of our climate mitigating stuff ourselves, it won't really matter because the feedback loops will be there so that they'll just keep getting warmer and warmer and warmer, and this is a real danger. And if you look, like in Siberia, there have been these huge blowholes that are just, someone's just flying over this area and they suddenly see this huge crater. It's like, what caused that? Well, it was the methane getting released, right? So, studying these sorts of things, you go, well, how can that apply to my story? So then I'll take that and I'll use that as an inspiration. So then it becomes a motivating factor for, well, maybe climate change has pushed us so far that we got to go start finding other places to live. So then now I have a reason to go to the nearest star, so that's the kind of thought process that can occur. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. This is great. And you're touching on this a little bit, Jeffrey, with what you just shared, but I know we've had some conversations around, film, books, social film dramas. You can unite people in a common sense of humanity and shared responsibility. We talked a little bit about the influence of sci-fi and certainly the mediums that your content showing up in front of. How do you think, or what responsibility do you think movie producers and makers and authors have in terms of the influence they can have on society? Like, it's a big.
Oh my gosh, see, that's a fantastic question. I will tell you, there's two sides to this, right? It's really interesting. I'm going to say something really controversial for a second. There's a debate right now about, do video games cause people to be more violent, right? For example, watching violent movies and TV shows, does that cause people to become more violent? Mm-hmm. Now it's interesting because I've looked at it and I've looked at the research and I've thought a lot about it, and I'll go, well, okay. I don't think it makes somebody be violent. Of course not, right? That people have choices to make. But what I do think could start to happen is culturally, we could end up being desensitized, right? The more that we're experiencing this sort of content and this sort of visuals, it starts to desensitize us to the realities of these things like violence and things like that. So as a filmmaker, the reason why I bring that up, I feel I have a responsibility to not contribute to that. I want to make content that a family can watch. I was really frustrated when my children were young and there were things that I wanted them to see, and the content was just so over the top in certain ways. I'm like, I can't let my kids watch this, and as a responsible parent. I also look at things like the original Star Trek and how, when working, and I'm sure, Kevin, you experience this all the time. It's like, when I was working with people at NASA, the number of folks that I would meet who would say, yeah, I'm here because I watched Star Trek when I was a kid. Now, people might say, well, how can watching Star Trek make you a scientist? Well, what happens is you watch a show like that and you go, Spock, that's really cool what he's doing right now. It's like, what's he doing? How did they do that? They've got that technology. They're doing these things. Gosh, when I grow up, I'd like to do that. So you start trying to find ways to make the real world into the world of your dreams in a certain way, right? If you look, a lot of young people right now are in forensics because they watched CSI. There's a whole, right. that area is, criminal investigation. So it exploded a few years ago, because a certain generation saw those shows. So there's a direct impact between media and culture, media and society.
Sure.
and I think that as a filmmaker, as an author, whatever, I think we have to look at. I'm not saying that all types of content. I think there's lots of room for different types of content. But when I think about the mainstream, I think we should be very careful about the messages and the ideas that we're putting out, because we can really impact broad swaths of people in very negative ways without even realizing it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, and more importantly, last thing I'll say, my biggest concern nowadays, more than violence or any of the other stuff, is stupidity. I just feel like there's so much dumb content that's making us stupid, right? That it's like, that's what scares me more than anything, is that we have this, you have a huge portion of American population that doesn't know basic science facts, basic historical facts, these sorts of things, but they can tell you all about pop culture. That's so dangerous. It's so dangerous. So for me, creating sci-fi that can appeal to those people and get them to start to think a little more is super important.
Absolutely. There's so much content that has such a limited view. It really is selling our society short in terms of what's out there, what's capable, and we're hoping to engender some passion and desire for change in people. Seeing that. Kevin, your thoughts on that?
And I've so much there to unpack that I would just love to respond to. But I confess that I was the Star Trek generation. I watched it as a little kid, and it was because of Star Trek and science fiction that I went to the University of Wisconsin and got my degree in astronomy, because I wanted to know what is a black hole, and what is a galaxy, and what is a quasar, and what is a nebula, and I kept seeing all this in science fiction, and I wanted to know what it was. So that's how I got my degree. So I can write science fiction, at least use the right terminology. I hate it when somebody goes on a movie and says, well, the rocket ship is leaving Earth and it's going across the galaxy to Mars, and then they're going to leave the solar system until they reach a new light years. And I'm like, oh, come on. And I take great pride in my very first Star Wars book. On page 1, I made myself fix the big mistake in the Star Wars where Han Solo says the Millennium Falcon is so fast it can do the Kessel Run in under 12 light years. Under 12 parsecs. Under 12 parsecs. Yeah. And I just went, well, that doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
And so I wrote it. I don't have to explain it all, but I made the Kessel Run a cluster of black holes, and you had to go certain speeds to go shorter distances, and so I made the thing make sense. So I got inspired by that. Another comment about being desensitized to violence. Just last night, my wife and I watched up to episode 7 of season 3 of The Boys, which is a very dark superhero show. And the first episode, it's like very graphic, exploding heads and intestines flying all over the place, and it's like the most gross and incredible special effects of bodies being ripped apart. And by episode 7, we were kind of sitting there going, I wonder how many heads are going to pop this episode. And it just, you see it over and over and over again. So I do think it desensitizes you. And if you're playing video games and you're spending all day long first-person shooter just blowing heads off of people, I'm not saying anything that you shouldn't play video games, but I don't see how you can say that doesn't desensitize you.
That's the term for me. It's desensitization, and then when you have a culture of people who are desensitized, then what starts to happen, right? Then those are the questions I start asking, right? It's like it's the thing. So, yeah, but I'm with you. I'm not saying don't play video games, but I do think you could ask the question, like if you have a teenager who spends 5 hours a day shooting people in a simulation, that has to have some sort of effect. That's like I said, doesn't make them go out and shoot people. Not saying that, but it has to have some sort of desensitization. So let's move on. So
And here's the important part of kind of to the core question that you guys just asked about the responsibilities of writers. There was like 10 years ago or so, a big best-selling writer who was a friend of mine, big best-selling writer, wrote a big kind of science fiction-y thriller. The whole thing was based on denying climate change, and that it was all a conspiracy, and the whole thing was laying out that it isn't real and you shouldn't take it serious, and it's all a big government hoax. And it was a pretty good thriller, but I talked to him. I said, why would you do this? They're going to be your readers who believe it. And it turns out he believes it. He's a big climate change
Ooh.
denier.
Yeah.
This is what
Yeah.
he's putting up. And so the book sold millions of copies.
Sure.
And so millions of his readers were probably convinced of this hoax because he wrote it. Now, as a writer, I could concoct a really cool story about climate change really just being a big hoax and all the government conspiracies setting it up and all the who would do that and why, and there are companies that make profits because of reaction, that like the solar power industry is setting up a conspiracy to make climate, that I'm a good enough writer that I could make up that story. And I could write a good thriller that really sets up that climate change is a hoax. But my responsibility is not to do that, because even if I write a really good story and I convince one person that it's a hoax, then I've done damage.
Yeah.
And
No,
that's
you're
responsibility as a writer. It's not just if I'm telling a good story that might cause somebody to do bad things, maybe you should self-censor. There's another. Stephen King wrote a book called Danse Macabre earlier in his career about his relationship with horror fiction, and he did this whole assessment of some other horror writer had written a novel about this gang of kids that go beat up homeless people and set them on fire for fun. Well, when that book was, it was a thriller, but when the book was published, incidents of people doing that like quadrupled because they read the book.
Yeah.
Now, do you have freedom of speech to tell that story? Yeah. But if you're writing that book, what goes through your head that I just might have killed a couple of homeless people because somebody got inspired to set them on fire reading my book?
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. There's an ugly cycle
Well,
that we're talking about
I
here.
think the key here is that we're really illuminating there's more responsibility media creators have than they realize sometimes.
Right.
That's the point, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
I was thinking about this on the way in today, and I was going to ask you a question about this. And I don't know, and we're getting close to this because people consume media through books, but very much through movies, and how much of history they know through movies that have not been documentaries, right, or have changed history, right? It was controversy around when JFK and that story was depicted, right, where you're like, no, you can't change history in what seems like a documentary, and all of a sudden that's what people think. That's what the conspiracy theorists love that, and it doesn't. And then all the stuff when it comes to depicting violence and having people really the responsibility piece and the desensitizing leads to not caring. Like people don't care about the things because they've already seen it, right? There's no.
Well, yeah, it's really interesting because I think also you look at cultures where they're actually experiencing some of these things that we're seeing as entertainment. They couldn't even get their heads around this. They're trying to get away from that horror, and so the idea that we're watching it as entertainment would be like, wait, what? It's like it's incongruous, right? Yeah.
So I want to go to like writing about the future and designing the future, and I know Kevin wants to talk about the aspect, because we have to mention design, and it was such a fascinating conversation we had last week about design in the future. And Jeffrey, you've mentioned, like you're crossing into product design, architecture, all kinds of fields of design, which is so fascinating, and getting into the nitty-gritty detail about this. But Kevin, I want to start with you as far as your perspective on designing the future and what that looks like, and the optimistic side of it.
Well, yeah, so we can be optimistic too, but I don't want everybody to be doom and gloom. But one of the things, we keep talking about science fiction predicting the future or test running the future or whatever. But one of the other things that science fiction does, especially in the design aspect, is that they create the future. That science fiction makes up some cool looking thing, and a real designer, physicist, inventor is inspired to do that.
Mhm.
I happen to know that the guy who and I forget his name right now, the guy who actually invented and built the first nuclear submarine called the Nautilus was inspired to do that because he read about the Nautilus and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And a more specific thing, Star Trek, that everybody has seen Star Trek. Back in the 60s, they had their flip phone communicators. You know, somebody was inspired by looking at those flip phone communicators to design a cell phone and a flip phone. And what you got to remember also is, the Apple Newton was one of the very first PDAs that came out. And I know
Mhm.
the Apple design team wanted to come up with something like a tricorder from Star Trek. And if you remember from Star Trek The Next Generation, the earlier years, they were always bringing Captain Picard an iPad to look at and sign. They didn't exist at the time. It was a pad. They handed him and it looks exactly like an iPad.
Kevin, did you ever in 2001: A Space Odyssey? They have basically iPads in 1968. Okay, you can see it on board the Discovery. It's really something. So
I want to go back and watch. Now I'm like, I
yeah,
want to go
yeah. I can
know,
tell you.
I know.
I can even send you an
I
email
haven't.
with
We
the image from it. It's
watched.
really something.
Wait,
They have digital
watched-
pads. They're watching TV news on digital pads with buttons on it, and they basically have an iPad. And they made this in 1968. I mean, it's really
amazing.
and you know. Well, I don't want to take this from Kevin, but I'll jump on it when you're ready. Yeah.
Okay. Well, one other example that when you remember the Star Trek: The Next Generation, when they showed you the engineering room and all those screens were all the touch screens with the graphics and designs on them, that we take it for granted now, but that was new then.
Right.
Somebody on the set design made those computer screens look like that. And another science fiction movie that, it had a huge impact, although the movie itself wasn't that great. But the Tom Cruise Minority Report, when they had all the heads up,
the
holographic displays
gestural stuff.
moving around,
Yeah.
that was that was the coolest part of that movie. That's the first time any of us saw this, when they had the heads up displays and they were moving icons around. And now it seems like, well, of course we're going to do stuff like that. But
Right.
that was the design in the movie that surely inspired engineers to do stuff because that looked so cool. Now,
Sure.
Jeff, throw it back over to you.
No, absolutely. I would say, you know, I want to go back. What was the initial question again? Because I'm so off in 2001 in my head.
Designing the future.
Design of the future and the
Designing the
influence.
future. Designing
Designing
the
the
future. I
future.
guess. Yeah, I always go back to. I would highly recommend everyone in watching this check out the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey and think about it. Try not to think about it in the context of now, but try to imagine, a film that was made in the late 1960s. And part of what made that film stand out so much from all the other sci-fi stuff, because you look at sci-fi stuff in the 50s and 60s, a lot of it's really, really cheesy. It's very, really bad effects, and 2001 looks really cool now. It still does over 50 years later. And I think the reason why is because he didn't go to Hollywood design people. He went to super advanced design, designers out of Europe who designed furniture or clothing or products and things like that. And he brought them in to help design the future in that film. So he went to a completely different source than you normally would. And it's really quite amazing what they came up with. The thing for me in doing futuristic design is I try to look at trends. I try to look at, I'm always researching what are people doing? What are they working on? The only problem that you run into is if you start to project things so far into the future where, because in all likelihood, some of the things that people will be using and doing, we couldn't even relate to right now. You're right. I mean, it's like, there are things we're doing right now. If you said to somebody, I tell my kids about, there's this, there's a TV show, and I had to just kind of memorize when it would come on in reruns because I wanted to, right. I mean, I'm thinking pre-VHS, right? No, it's like before VHS, right? Or whatever, right? Betamax, all that stuff. I mean, you think about that, or, you used to have these phones with these long cords on them. And you didn't want your parents to hear your phone call, so you go out and you take the cord and you go around the corner. And I tell my kids about that stuff, and it's kind of interesting. So you know, the idea of where we are now, if you said to someone, you know, 30 years ago, hey, your phone is actually going to be a camera and a computer and have access to all the knowledge, and you know, it wouldn't, we couldn't even compute that. You know what I mean? It's like,
Right.
really, your phone? Well, that doesn't sound like a phone, right? So the thing for me is you do have to dial it back a little bit to make it believable.
Sure.
Right, and understandable to an audience, right? So it's like, I have an artificial intelligence in the movie Persephone, and in all likelihood, an artificial intelligence by, you know, the 22nd century is going to be something we can't even comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
You know, right? I mean, some of the things I literally, you guys have to hear this. Aaron, you're going to dig this. This week, the new script that I just finished, we had an AI read the script, and then the AI read the script. The AI looked at all of the characters, all the character relationships. It predicted box office. It predicted. So in other words, I said, well, here's some of the actors I'm thinking, and it took it and it said, well, if you have those actors, we have a 90% projection that your movie will make this much money by this amount of time, and do this and this and this. It was insane. It was insane. And the part I was really skeptical, and it actually got it pretty right.
I was going to ask, you saw data after the fact, you're like, oh, this.
Oh, I saw the data. I was like, there's no way. And so then
I'm
we've
in a
been
house of
refining the
mirrors.
data and putting new information into the AI and refining it. So it's crazy. I wouldn't have even thought of this even 6 months ago. Even 6 months ago, you know?
Yeah.
So I mean,
yeah.
So I mean, there are things coming that I think we can't even conceive of, and there's also some things coming that could be pretty scary, you know? So
Right.
yeah. So all that affects design for me as I design these films, and I try to figure it out, because I also have to have an audience relate to it. That's a key element.
Absolutely.
Well, there's also one of the things that you know, science fiction has always done. The evil Skynet computer is going to take over and melt down society, and Terminator robots are going to kill us because robots hate humans. And I think I'm not sure that's thinking would go straight, but still, it is one of those where it is so ubiquitous. Even 5 years ago, I could not have imagined that. One of my friends was one of the first people that I knew who had installed the Echo Dots in his house to turn lights on and off. And I just thought, wow, that's really cool. And how advanced is that? You can turn your lights on and off by saying, and we haven't even mentioned yet, think of how much the Ring doorbell camera has changed our lives.
Right.
That's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems kind of a silly little thing, but that is literally, oh, I can see who's at the front door.
Right.
Oh, I've got pictures of my porch pirates. I mean, all of this has changed our lives, and we are rolling with it and advancing it, so that I 1000% second what Jeffrey was saying, that if I write a story about high tech set 300 years from now, it's just an absurd exercise. You can't possibly be accurate and be relatable to today's audience, because it'll be so evolved none of us will even recognize. And one of the big things that we've kind of skated over is the interface between humans and technology.
Yeah.
And the interface now with I'll say Alexa, and she's going to wake up. But the interface now is so invisible. Like I said, I can walk through my house and name the AI that I don't want to wake up right now and say, well, when was Charlton Heston born? And just that answer is at my fingertips. We used to have to work for information. We used to have to do research to find basic data.
I'm going to say one thing, because I want to make sure we any other questions you guys have for us before we run out of time. But I want to say one thing that I think is really important, which is the danger that I see with all this, that's underlying all of it to me, is I don't believe that we as a species are advancing with the technology. That's what I think is the most dangerous thing. And if we don't put more effort and time into developing this, right, and develop, right, because some of the things, like Kevin, when you talked about the idea that we're using, people don't use maps. I used to be so good at using maps, right? All right, and then okay, so or the idea, I had all my phone numbers memorized. Shoot, I could barely know my kids' phone numbers right now because the way that's set up in my phone. You know, these are concerns. These are concerns, and this is something I think it would behoove us to actually write a story someday about this.
Yeah,
you know,
I agree.
I think it's
nobody can remember how to do the basic. Could you do, any of you here, could you do long division? You know, with the little rack up there with the remainders, and I couldn't do it anymore.
Right.
Right.
I
No,
couldn't do it then.
right.
But I
Right. I could do
No, that's a great point. The lost art of
Yeah.
no,
But yeah, technology replacing,
Right.
not just replacing us, because I think we get this evil depiction of it's replacing us like in a short period of time. It's replacing us and we don't even know it, right? It's already there.
Well,
It's already
we're
shown.
causing it to. Well, the one thing that drives me nuts, okay, is when people say, robots are going to take over. They're going to take our jobs. I'm like, robots are not choosing to take people's jobs. Corporations are choosing to replace people with robots. Human beings are making that choice. There's not like there's this force of nature that's bringing AI and robotics into replace humans. Humans are making that choice because they're saving money, right?
Yeah.
We have to remember that. It's super
And we're as individuals are choosing not to advance our minds to be able to manage those robots or to be able to be in a role to create those robots, right?
Yeah.
You're right. I mean, it is some scary stuff when it comes to the future.
Well,
I didn't know we were going to go down this path, but it is.
I want to throw in another thing though, kind of an opposite caveat to that the fact that I don't know how to do long division means that I don't waste time doing long division. I can spend my time doing something else. Like the time that I would spend going to the reference section in the library to look up Napoleon's birthday, that time I can now spend editing my book or doing something else. And
well, that might be time you're spending editing a book, but some people are spending that time sitting on a couch eating pizza.
But,
right.
But I guess what I was getting
Go ahead.
What I was getting at is that I don't weave the cloth for my own clothes either anymore because technology makes that happen. And so the fact that we've lost certain skills, true. I mean, if there was like a complete EMP that wiped out all of our electronics, our electrical grid, our internet and everything, we would be in bad shape even to remember how to make penicillin or how to do basic things.
Oh yeah.
But
no.
The fact that I don't have to do a bunch of like trivial things means that I can spend that time doing something else. Now, whether people choose to learn something or better themselves, or whether they choose to watch
pizza, Lori.
The Real House.
I like pizza.
We're watching comments come in.
The comments are coming in. Sorry. Yeah. So
All right,
pizza's awesome.
So I was trying not to be anti-tech that we were losing our skills because look, I don't do long division because I don't need to do long division. And
I want to button it up. Let me button it up.
Right.
The bottom line is technology is awesome, but we have to advance along with it. We have to make sure that we aren't falling behind, and that our intellectual the idea that we would have advanced technology when the Industrial Revolution happened, right? The idea was it was give people more time to develop their mind or more time to do other things. What we're doing now is we're sitting around more. We're not it's making us lazy. So I say don't be lazy and use the technology. And then who knows what we could become? Who knows what we could become? That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
That's
a great button up.
Yeah.
That's a great conclusion to this. We have unfortunately, run out of time. Which is
another hour, please. Or part two, Dave Buchanan. Yes, part 2 would be great at a later date.
I'll do a part 2. I'd happy to. Let's do a part 2. Let's do another one. Let's do another
one.
We
said it here. We're doing a part 2.
We're doing a part 2. We have to do a part 2 because we have to. We also have to get into the depiction of the positive too, because there is.
Oh no, absolutely.
And we didn't spend too much time on the negative, but there's a cautionary tale. You're right, very much so. That we have to advance our brains at the same pace because we're not evolving as a species, and that's scary for sure. But I want to make sure we conclude this because we've had 2 amazing guests who spent more than an hour with us, and I thank you both for doing this. Sure. And I look forward to part 2 on this in the near future because I know there's definitely more to discuss. We have a long list of questions that we didn't get to, and this has been absolutely amazing. And thank you, Jeffrey, for taking the time and for being an amazing client.
Awesome.
And Kevin,
thank you.
It's been wonderful to get to know you and a like-minded individual.
You sent us the questions yesterday, and I read down them. I just went, well, we're not going to stick to this. It's going to go on.
we knew we wouldn't, and that's okay.
I know.
Well, I think Kevin and I got a new book or story or movie idea out of this, I still want to talk about it. So I think it's worth
Oh,
talking
all
about.
right.
Yes.
Love
yes.
it.
No, thank
Please
you
do
guys.
that.
Really, it's always
Part
great
two.
to have an opportunity
Yeah.
to talk about these sorts of things, especially in a public forum. And
Yeah.
and I think Kevin and I have some really cool projects that we're developing and looking at in the future here as well. And I think, look, we want to build a positive future. That's super important. It's not over. It's just that if you take it seriously, you notice some things.
Right.
That's what
Yeah.
the conversation is
Yep.
really about.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. And I want to get into those on part 2.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
a wonderful thing.
Coming soon, for sure.
Okay.
Coming
Thanks
All right.
both
soon.
for joining
Thank you
us.
both so much. And we'll talk soon. Thanks.
All right. Oh, ooh.